Okay, good morning everyone, and can I welcome everyone to the 24th meeting in 2019 of the Social Security Committee. Can I remind everyone present to turn off mobile phones or other devices, put them to silent mode so it doesn't disrupt the meeting. We'll get a couple of apologies this morning. We'll get Alison Johnson and Mark Griffin, who unfortunately can't be with us this morning, with some other members who are hoping to be with us in the next wee while. And we move to agenda item 1, which is decision to take an item in private, and the committee is asked to agree to take item 3, consideration of evidence in private. Is the committee agreed to that? Thank you very much. We now move to agenda item 2, and that's benefits take-up inquiry. This is the first evidence session of the committee's inquiry into benefit take-up to explore how take-up for both reserved and devolved social security benefits can be improved. This week's session comprises of 2 panels. I'm delighted to welcome our first panel, Professor Paul Spicker, Emeritus Professor of Public Policy, Robert Gordon University, Professor Mark Shooksmith, Professor of Planning, Newcastle University, and Professor David Bell, Professor of Economics, University of Stirling. Gentlemen, thank you very much for coming along this morning. We appreciate your assistance. We thought it appropriate to start with an underpinning of how we get accurate estimates of what benefits or entitlements are actually being claimed in the first place, and where the weaknesses there may or may not be in that. It's maybe worth just setting the scene for anyone following the inquiry that they can vary greatly. Pension credit is estimated to have an uptake of 60%. I actually understand working tax credits for those without children has an eye-watering low take-up of mid-30s in terms of take-up levels. I know that going forward, the new Scottish benefits, the Scottish Child Payment, they're estimating that that might be an 84% take-up level. But of course, these are estimates, and what the reality on the ground out there can be 2 different things. So maybe just a very general question to open with. How confident are the witnesses here this morning that both the UK government via the DWP and HMRC can be pretty robust and accurate in terms of estimates of benefit take-ups, and what do you think needs to improve? And thanks for combating the noise we had in the background there. Who would like to open up more generally for a discussion on that? Professor Bell.
I'm happy to talk a little bit about that. More about the reasons why there are difficulties of getting accurate estimates rather than the reasons why people don't claim. I'm sure we'll come on to that. But essentially, estimates of take-up tend to rely on household surveys, and 1 or 2 of those, I think, are mentioned in the evidence that has appeared thus far. These are, first of all, relatively small. So there's always going to be a degree of inaccuracy associated with them. You know, typically 10,000 people across the UK as a whole. They rely largely on self-report. So do people actually know what benefits they are receiving? Sometimes that's not always clear to people. And then estimating take-up on the basis of how people report their own conditions is also fairly fraught. So many of these household surveys ask people questions like, can you walk 100 metres? You know, can you climb a flight of stairs? That sort of thing. But to go from that, a set of responses to questions like these and accurate assessment of whether people are eligible for benefit is a fairly big step, because of course people are not in a position to judge whether an outside assessor would say that whatever disability they may have should merit an award of a benefit. So that is quite difficult, and quite a lot of work has gone on in relation, for example, to attendance allowance, in trying to assess whether people whether the responses that people give in surveys can usefully predict whether people will actually be awarded the benefit or not. And that is, in fact, what Elaine Douglas and I did for this meeting with our own survey. And by and large, the kinds of answers that people give to questions about disability are pretty good predictors. But then there may be other things which also seem to predict whether people get benefits or not. So an interesting question might be whether whether there's a variation across levels of deprivation. So you might think perhaps people who are in more affluent areas would be better informed, therefore more likely to successfully claim the benefit. And we don't find that that is true. And that's an interesting finding in itself, because the benefits largely we're talking about are not means tested. So, in fact, what we find is that it's people in more deprived areas that are more likely to claim, which in a sense means that there is an income-related element to some of these benefits, in that the poorer people are more likely to claim it. But this is a complex area, and one which I think I've emphasised. It is vitally important that the Scottish Government gets this right, because the costs of getting it wrong, as I know from my past experience with free personal care, are potentially considerable.
Okay, thank you, Professor Spicker.
I would go a little further than Professor Bell, in that I would actually give you a straight no to your question as to whether or not you can ever have accurate estimates. The difficulties that there are in these figures have been things which we've been made aware of in a literature that stretches back over 60 years. And at every point, there are issues which make it almost impossible to know truly and precisely or accurately what the figures might be. The thing you have to begin with is a figure for the whole population that is eligible. And the more that is conditional, the more that it relies on meeting the qualifications of benefits, the less certain we are about that basic figure. Now, if we're talking about the whole population, which is the way in which we get estimates for child benefit and for certain classes of pension, we can at least start off with an idea that we're talking about a sample which reflects that population. But if we haven't even got that, then we are making educated guesses at best. And that's certainly true in relation to disability. The Office of National Statistics did an ad hoc survey for the DWP, where they tried to look in more detail at whether or not people were disabled, whether or not they were entitled. Fully 2/3 of that sample were people who said that they were not disabled, and another 12 or 13% said that they were only disabled sometimes. Now, that means that you're talking about more than 3/4 of the population with disabilities who don't recognise themselves as being within the eligible population. And that when that is true, we've then got to say, well, how on earth can we possibly know what the situation ought to be? There have been a series of censuses of disability based on the same kind of point scheme, which is now used for disability living allowance, PIP, and certain other benefits. That point scheme was actually initially designed for the censuses. When the first returns were made, the figures seemed to be reliable, accurate, they were tested, they were validated. And then when the thing was run again 8 years later, another 2 million people with disabilities were added to the census list. Then it was run again, and the figures went beyond 10 million people in the UK. It's really hugely difficult to rely on the base population figure, and that undermines much of what else you can do. I would invite you to be thinking about the figures in a different way. One of the things that we should always be aware of with official statistics is that they're not precise measures. They never are. They're always estimates. They're always based on some kind of survey or sample. They're always scaled up. What they do provide us with are indicators or pointers. And we take pointers together to see whether or not things are changing in a positive direction or a negative direction. That's about as much as we can look for.
Is there Smith, do you want to add?
Yes, I don't have anything to add on this point. That's not my area of expertise, the statistical base, but I can talk, and probably you'd like me to do that later, about why people don't take up benefits in rural areas.
Absolutely, we'll be looking at that. Can you just probe a little further so we know that there's various household surveys by which you capture, if you like, the state of the nation in terms of what their entitlements may be, or their conditions are at a point in time to then estimate who may be entitled to various benefits and entitlements. So Professor Bell was mentioning household surveys, Professor Spricker was mentioning censuses, I think in plural terms, so there's no kind of catch-all regular household survey specifically designed to capture, if you like, the state of the nation in Scotland or the UK on an annual basis. I know there's the household survey, but that's not specifically designed to estimate who may be entitled to benefits. Is there a fragmented approach to collecting the data in the first place?
So, there are, as I said, a number of surveys. The one which actually was used in relation to free personal care was an add-on survey to a survey that the DWP have carried out annually for quite a long time, called the Family Resources Survey, which is mentioned in the evidence. Much of the work in England has been done with a thing called the English Longitudinal Survey of Ageing, which is a survey of the over 50s. It has the great advantage that it's longitudinal, and one of the points I make in my paper is that often disability benefits are long-term commitments. And what the English Longitudinal Survey of Ageing does is it revisits people every 2 years to see if, to ask people quite a wide variety of questions around about their household, but these will include what we call activities of daily living and instrumental activities of daily living, which is what can people, what functions are they able to carry out. Now, Scotland was one of the relatively few parts of the world that didn't have such a survey until recently, and the survey that we've used, which is actually funded by the US National Institute of Aging and is called Haggis, is the first attempt at a longitudinal survey, which would revisit people from time to time. But, well, it's restricted to those, as most of these surveys are, to those aged 50 plus. But for most of the surveys, most of the benefits that Scotland is taking over, the majority, well, for the overall population receiving benefits from Social Security Scotland, most of them will be aged more than 50.
Okay. Professor Spricker, do you want to add anything?
Listen, it's a slightly different point, and it concerns the question of eligibility and take-up. There's a point made long ago by A.B. Atkinson in reviewing issues on take-up where he was particularly concerned with pensioners, and he invited governments to think whether or not eligibility was the same as the group that was being targeted. Now, there are many cases where what we actually do is define benefit rules quite deliberately, more broadly than the target group, so that way we can be reasonably sure of including the people we actually want to include. An example of that, or a simple example at the moment, might be the debate that's being conducted about television licenses for the over 75s. It's quite clear we don't necessarily want to provide free television to everybody, but at the same time, trying to do it in any way which tests the actual target population, who is isolated, who is in need of this, could be hugely complex. So the eligibility rules are different from the targeting rules. And maybe what you need to do is to focus more on the question of who it is you want to reach.
Okay, that makes sense to me. But what we're really trying to, I suppose, initially in this first set of questions, before we move on to entitlements and barriers and everything else, is just how robust current data may be and what changes you would suggest that you might wish to put on the record. Professor Bell was helpful by talking about the disability assistance that's coming to this place, because obviously that's going to be a significant financial exposure to Parliament and government. So specifically on that, we've already heard from the Fiscal Commission that there could be quite significant errors of forecasting at the outset because you don't have your own baseline you're establishing your own baseline in the first few years. So Professor Bell, specifically on the disability assistance entitlements coming to this place, how robust do you think the estimates are likely to be on that, and what additional work do you think might be required in that area?
So the Fiscal Commission understandably is concerned with the aggregates. So I think that the work that they've done is on basically trends in claimants. So it's numbers of claimants for the different benefits that are being received. And the data on actual claims is very good. There's no question about that. You know, we know to, you know, within a postcode address, or small set of postcode addresses, how many people are claiming which benefits in those areas. Now, there are trends for Scotland as a whole, and you can compare these to trends in other parts of the UK. That's of great interest if you're interested in what effect there will be on the Scottish budget of the transfer of the social security benefits, because it's the Barnett formula that's going to be used by and large. So our trends relative to the trends in the rest of the UK are very important. And there are, I've done some work on this that I haven't published, but I'd be happy to share with the committee around this. And I can understand the Fiscal Commission's reason for focusing on trends, because it will get at this issue of how much Barnett consequentials Scotland is going to get as a result of any difference in the trends between the two countries. But if you're actually wanting to look at why people claim, how they claim, and the set of benefits that they actually are claiming, then the only way you can go is through the household surveys. And so the DWP does fund, for example, it pays quite a lot, quite a significant proportion of the English longitudinal survey of ageing, and also the family resources survey. But neither of these is perfect. There are all kinds of rather obscure statistical reasons why you end up with estimates from these surveys which differ from what the DWP knows are the number of claimants in any particular area. Work is going on. There's a lot of work going on trying to refine these, and I think it is very important for Scotland to be part of these discussions, so that we understand who is claiming, what barriers there may be to to them claiming, and I guess also issues around assessment procedures, and none of the existing household surveys ask those questions. It would be quite easy to add a module to see if people have gone through assessments.
Yeah, I think that's Professor Spiker. Did you want to come in?
Sorry, a cautionary tale about trying to use these figures predictively. When DLA was introduced, it was originally thought that it was going to be quite a limited benefit. Over the course of the last 10 to 15 years, DLA gradually expanded, mainly because of three factors. They were psychiatric illness, people with fluctuating conditions, and also a growing number of older people receiving extensions of the benefit past the formal eligibility age. All of those factors were retained into personal independence payment. All of them are still there, and as far as I can tell, the figures are still growing. When the government announced PIP, it believed and said quite plainly that it was going to save money. It actually fined the Northern Ireland Assembly for its refusal to implement PIP directly by the amount of saving which they deemed would be made as a result of introducing PIP. We now have the audit figures in on PIP, and it hasn't saved a penny. Now, effectively, we cannot rely on predictive factors for a situation which is dynamic and changing.
I'm very tempted to go down a rabbit hole of policy spillover, which is something that we're looking at in another place. But before I bring the Deputy Convener in on this, can I just ask about the data we have? Because I think what I'm hearing is the data is as robust as it can be at present time, but things are constantly changing. Don't put words in your mouth, but as you change eligibility criteria, as you raise awareness, as you create new benefits, then the information that you have to capture has to evolve and change with that as well, I suspect. I suppose what I'm seeking to look at now would be, if I was looking at some of these figures, I would want to know, is the uptake level for PIP greater or lesser amongst BME communities, or is it greater or lesser for women, or is it greater or lesser in rural areas, Professor Shooksmith, or we could pick other entitlements and do a similar exercise. Are under 25s less likely to claim some entitlements than others? So we can get beneath the surface of the aggregate predicted cohort within society that could, in theory, claim. Those who do claim, you get your, it's 40%, it's 50%, it's 70%, but beneath that, are there other inequalities in terms of a variable take-up rate based on whether you're BME, based on whether you stay in a rural area, based on whether you're male or female, under 25, and is that captured anywhere?
So, it seems to me that these are obviously very important questions that we need to understand, and the way that one might approach this, with all the caveats around surveys and so on, is to try to see whether, and this is what I tried to show, and I wouldn't go to the wall at all on any of my estimates, is to look at, are there other factors than disability itself which explains whether people claim that they are receiving a benefit or not. So, if I found that for some reason the probability that somebody in an ethnic minority group was less likely to claim, then that would be a little bit of evidence to suggest, well, maybe there's an argument for trying to increase take-up among that kind of group, and the only way you're going to do that, it seems to me, is with a survey.
Complete the survey in the first place as well.
Well, so there are a load of other issues around response rates to surveys, and that's getting increasingly difficult. But it does seem to me that you can't abandon this as an exercise. It is worth trying to understand the claims procedure.
Okay, I mentioned rurality there, Professor Shricksmith. I wonder if there's something you want to say in relation to whether we've got enough data in relation to that.
Yes, thank you very much, Convener. There are very few studies which actually disaggregate these estimates that have been talked about in terms of rural areas as against non-rural, or by settlement size or by sparsity. There are consistent findings from studies that have been done in rural areas that take up of most benefits, if not all benefits, is lower in rural areas, but the only study which I know of which has actually followed the methodology which has been outlined by Professor Bell, that is, using the Family Resources Survey to estimate those who might be entitled and comparing that with administrative data, is a study which was done by Jonathan Bradshaw and Dominic Richardson back in 2007 out of York University in relation to pension credit. And that followed that methodology and found that whereas in urban areas, 35% of those eligible for pension credit were not claiming. In the villages and landward areas, as we might describe them in Scotland, 54% of those eligible for pension credit were not claiming. So there's a very marked disparity there in the claiming amongst those eligible. Now, the other research which has been done is more on the basis of surveys of those claiming and non-claiming rather than comparing with the eligibility population, and then goes on to look into the reasons for that, which I think we'll come on to.
I think we'll come to that shortly. So that's a very helpful example where the committee would want to know the quality of the data, because how can we recommend directing uptake campaigns and entitlement campaigns in an effective way if we don't have access to where those disparities are? So that's very helpful.
It does mean that it's very unreliable to use claimant counts as any sort of proxy for levels of poverty when you're comparing rural and urban areas.
Fair point. Deputy Convener.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the evidence so far. It's very helpful in understanding the basis of our inquiry, which is benefit uptake. But of course, there's a close relationship between that and the scrutiny that we are also doing on the transfer of budget too. So, if I'm steering out with your area of expertise, just let me know. But it's just too good an opportunity to pass up. So we talked about the predictability or unpredictability of some benefits. That was a good example that you gave us about DLE and the way that was expected to save money. I just wanted to draw attention, Professor Bell, to your submission, and you've mentioned it already, which is the assessments of the unmet need in free personal care. Now, my interest in this is the relationship between predicting benefits and whether or not we have the right formula for the budget, because it strikes me unless we've got some flexibility in there to take account of this, then you would worry, which is where I'm now steering a wee bit out of the bounds of the inquiry, but it's too good an opportunity to pass up, which is how we're going to make sure there's a stability on the current level of uptake for going forward. Never mind anything we'd want to examine about automation of benefits or higher uptake, because we're now clear that that's going to have implications for the budget, but leaving that to one side. So on page 3, Professor Bell talk about the lesson from the Scottish Government experience with free personal care is that the accurate assessment potential take-up on unmet needs are of critical importance for the financial viability of any policy which provides cash benefits or benefits in kind to the Scottish population. And then at the bottom of the page you see there is further evidence of the need to accurately predict variations in take-up. Significant, and this is the bit I'm getting to, significant underestimates will pose a threat to the overall Scottish Government budgets, possibly for an extended period of time. I just wondered if you wanted to say more about that.
Well, so I was part of the Care Development Group, which was the body that was set up by the Scottish Government in 2000, I think, and it recommended the adoption of the Royal Commission suggestion that personal care be provided free. We commissioned a study which was done at Aberdeen University, which used what was called a disability follow-up that was associated with the Family Resources Survey to estimate unmet need. The numbers that that study came up with were relatively small, and those numbers drove the budget, or the proposed budget, for free personal care. I've got to say that we are, despite what we've been saying already, we are in a much better position now to understand the implementation of existing benefits than was the case with free personal care, which was really not well understood. Some local authorities were already providing free personal care. And actually the numbers, the estimated overspend on free personal care is itself an estimate, because there was no clear a starting point for the costings, given the different practices by different local authorities. So in that sense, we're in a better position, but in one sense, we're in a worse position because we're now talking over 9% of the Scottish budget. So getting it wrong, the implications will be much bigger for the Scottish budget if we did get it wrong. And I should have caveated what I said there, in the sense that in my submission, in that what matters is not just whether Scotland increases its take-up per se, but rather does it increase its take-up relative to trends in the rest of the UK, because that's what will determine the Barnett money coming through. And I have done some work on that, and I'd be happy to share that with the committee. I didn't include that with my initial paper.
It would be helpful, but it's taken the committee a bit of time to understand the relationship between the increase in uptake and relative to the budget. Just to finally on that, do you think there's, I mean, given that, and I'm glad you said we're in a better position, so that's a bit more hopeful, but do you think there needs to be a bit more flexibility then, given that they've still got a level of unpredictability of trends in the fiscal framework to accommodate that? Do you think that
I mean, I put my finance committee hat on now. There are a number of risks that the Scottish budget will face each year, and we've seen some of these have a very significant effect on this, or will have next year, which is around the shortfall in income tax receipts. And it's a very complicated story why it's turned out the way it's turned out, but nevertheless it's a negative effect on the Scottish budget. And so the question really, it seems to me, in terms of the fiscal framework, is should there be more flexibility in terms of borrowing capacity to deal with unexpected fluctuations in these major components of Scotland's budget. And it seems to me there's a strong case for doing that. You wouldn't want to have this on, you know, you'd have to adjust your budget in the medium term at least, so that you weren't constantly borrowing to fund additional social security spending. But it does seem to me, with the review of the fiscal framework coming up in 2021, 22, these are the kinds of issues that have to be on the table.
Thank you. Just lastly, what you said there, what matters is the increase in take up relative to trends. So let's see. So you could imagine where there was a promotion of a benefits uptake. So Scottish Government spend lots of money, and you can see that there's a direct correlation. So we've affected our trend, if you like, whereas in other parts of the UK, so you might expect in that discussion, then we would have to pay for that.
That might be the case. Of course, it does get really complicated. It depends how much effort is being put into uptake south of the border as well. So if they equally are making efforts to increase uptake, then that would possibly have a neutral effect on the Scottish budget. And the question is, how effective can these promotion policies be? I don't have a strong view about that, but they're already, obviously it does reflect what the unmet need is, and we unfortunately we're guessing, but I guess the feeling I have is that it's certainly less than the kind of unmet need that we faced at the time of free personal care.
Thank you very much.
Before we move on to the next line of question, either witnesses want to add anything to that? Okay, Alistair Allen.
Thank you. I was interested in what you said, Professor Spicker, at the beginning there about the self-identification as disabled or not. And I appreciate that makes the task of measuring some of this very difficult indeed, but is there anything that can be done to clarify that question in the minds of people with disabilities? How should policymakers approach that problem that you've described?
I'm not sure that anything can be done. There is a marked difference between the experience of people who have successfully claimed a benefit and the people who have not successfully claimed a benefit. And that's something that you'd expect. For example, it's fairly obvious that people who claim the benefit are far less likely to see the complexity of the benefit as a barrier to having received it than the people who have failed to claim. There's been some very interesting studies about unsuccessful claimants to see what their experience has been. And part of the problem is that people really understand these benefits very, very badly, that they don't know what they're for, if they are receiving ESA or its equivalent, because it's now moving into universal credit, then a fair number say, I might as well have a crack at this, although it's completely inappropriate for the criterion of the benefit, and they get rejected on that basis. So it's difficult to say that clearly that this is a benefit for people with disabilities. There's lots of confusion in the language. We don't really understand, I'm afraid, what DLA is for, what PIP is for, what attendance allowance is for. It helps, obviously, if you understand that attendance allowance is not actually about attendance. We have these problems running through the benefit system. And unfortunately, a lot of what people are being told doesn't necessarily square with the benefit rules either. I mean, it's pretty clear that neither DLA nor PIP could be considered to be an extra costs benefit. So representing it as an extra costs benefit is misleading for the people who've got extra costs. Now, I am disappointed that the options that have been chosen in relation to disability benefits have been to replicate a system which has been proven to cause such confusion and so many problems, and that there hasn't been an attempt to try to clarify for the benefit of potential claimants who the benefits are actually for. I think that it would be helpful to have a severe disablement allowance, which theoretically at least, the Scottish Parliament now has the powers to do. It would be helpful to have a mobility allowance, because people, I think, have a pretty rough idea of what it is that's involved with mobility. I'm afraid when it comes to things like the care components on DLA and PIP, it is completely baffling. And people don't really know. I'm not sure that clarity will necessarily either save money or cost money. The usual experience, however, is that clarity often costs money because that's the way in which you can move to encourage people with unmet needs to have those needs met.
You're pointing to a lack of clarity about benefits, but presumably you also, it was interested earlier on, you also indicated that there was a lack of clarity in people's minds about, you know, whether they regarded themselves as disabled or not.
And it does lead in the claiming process to a lot of churning, where people are claiming unsuccessfully because they're claiming inappropriately. So at the same time as we've got people who we want to claim not doing so, there are other people who are claiming who we didn't actually want to do it.
Okay, thank you. One of the other things I was keen to pick up on, and it's been mentioned earlier on, but was, well, when you talked around some of the trends that there may be in different parts of the country or within different communities, I was interested in, and maybe you don't see it as your role, but delving into the reasons behind those trends. Now, for instance, I know, Professor Shucksmith, you know my part of the world quite well, given the previous work you've done on crofting. My impression, anecdotally, is that in many parts of rural Scotland, there's an older generation of people who have pretty deep-set cultural worries about claiming benefits, including loss of face, including lack of belief that anything in their community is anonymous, including all sorts of, you know, cultural concerns about being perceived to receive rather than to give to a community. So I don't know whether you feel that any of that's within your scope or not, but I wonder, did you look at trends, or has anyone actually tried to delve into what the reasons might be for low take-up in rural areas?
Yes, there's quite a lot of information about the reasons for take-up being low. There's less on trends, but you mentioned that I've worked in your own constituency. 25 years ago, I did a study on these matters with Harris as one of the study areas, and that's again one of the study areas in our new project on rural lives. So we've been to Harris again, and we're trying to see what the differences might be. But it would be helpful if I talk through some of the explanations for lower take-up, and certainly the one that you've highlighted about the older generation being resistant, very concerned about visibility, privacy, stigma in small communities. And we've found that, and other researchers have found that, not just in rural areas of the islands, but across rural Scotland, in Northumberland as well, where I've recently done some work. And it's a feature I know from studies that have been done in the rural USA as well. So I think it's a feature of small rural communities in developed countries around the world. In addition to that, the older generation, we found in our work, often do not see themselves as poor, and it's similar sorts of issues to those raised by Professor Spicker, but it's couched in a different way. When I grew up, we didn't have running water or electricity or television, and now we have all those things. How can we be poor? And their reference point is often their own past rather than the everyday lifestyles of the majority today. So that's a barrier. And the question, how you overcome that is really quite a difficult ethical one, because do you want to persuade somebody that they're poor? Well, you do, in the sense that you want them to have the benefits, but you don't want them to change their view of themselves in a way that's harmful. The other reasons that we've come across in the literature and in our current work, distant sources of advice and information, often located in urban centres, and that's become, I think, more of an issue as the benefit system has become more and more complex, so that it's probably more necessary to have that advice and support, not just when you're making an initial claim, but when you're having to fill in journals on a regular basis and having regular assessments and appeals and all the rest of it. The fact that so much is now online is something which just wasn't there 25 years ago when we were working in Harris and other areas of rural Scotland. And it seems to me that's really important for rural claimants and rural take-up. not only because of the poor digital infrastructure, you know, whether there is broadband or a mobile signal, but also the cost of a digital connection. Can you afford to have broadband? If you've just relying on a mobile phone, is it pay as you go, which runs out, you know, 20 minutes into the hour and a half long session that you need to have? And, you know, how do you get the support from anybody while you're trying to work online? You know, where do you go and do it? Do you go to a public library, if there is a public library anywhere near you? Do you have to spread out all your personal papers all over, keep running over to the counter to ask somebody to come and help you with everything spread out for the world to see? I think another reason is housing tenure. I think there's quite a lot of research which shows that people who live in social housing are more likely to be informed and helped with the support in relation to availability of benefits, both from their landlords, their social landlords, but also from their peers. So that's an issue where poverty is much more likely to be in private housing in rural areas. So those are a set of things which are well established in the literature. I think just one or two other things which are beginning to emerge from our Rural Lives project, although this is very preliminary, we've only really just started doing fieldwork in two areas in rural Scotland. One is a worry that people have about moving on to universal credit because of the disability assessment regime that they perceive to be very threatening. They perceive that if they move on to universal credit, then they're more likely to be subjected to sanctions which stop all their benefits and which leave them in a much worse position. So even when they're told that they could be getting quite a lot more money by making that move on to universal credit, they see the risks in that as not worth taking. And the thing which is related to that, not only for disability benefits, is the unpredictability and volatility of incomes in many rural areas, whether it's to do with seasonality or casual work, having a number of jobs. It seems that there's quite a lot of evidence of unpredictability and volatility of incomes, which then leads to worries about overpayment, which you're not aware of happening, and then having to repay those debts, and in a sense going into debt and being sanctioned and all sorts of things as a result of that volatility of incomes. And if it helps the committee, a separate piece of work that we've just been doing along the lines that Professor Bell was talking about, looking at longitudinal data. We've been analysing the British Household Panel Survey, where households are interviewed every year, and looking at the rural households compared to the urban households for Britain, not just for Scotland, over the period since 1990. And it appears in that, first of all, the proportion of people who have been in poverty at some point over that period is almost the same in rural areas. 50% of the people in rural households were poor at some point from 1991 to 2008, compared with 55% in urban areas. But that those tend to be quite short periods, so it reinforces and underlines this point about the volatility of incomes moving in and out of poverty and that churn. I think the only other point to make, you're asking about trends. The other major trend we can see is the increased use of food banks, and you know there's all sorts of issues around that. We've had a very important report just a couple of days ago that you'll have seen in the news from the Trussell Trust about who is using food banks and the reasons for that. So I won't repeat that now, but you'll be aware of that.
Thank you, it's very interesting. Thank you, Convener.
Okay. Deputy Convener, I know you wanted to look at stuff around improving benefit take-up, if you want to come in at this point.
Thank you. Yeah, I mentioned earlier just the question of we found a different way of having a better way of people actually getting their benefits. Then that's something I'm interested to look at. So the committee have looked at the question of automation at a number of levels, I suppose the starting point is, if you were going to automate a system, I suppose you'd have to start by making an assumption that there's going to be much higher levels of expenditure, because if you can find a way to do it. So there's a number of councils who've been able to automate some of their benefits. Glasgow, I'm familiar with. So the school clothing grant was matched up quite easily because of the uptake on, so if you're eligible housing benefits, so you could do that one. It's become a wee bit more complicated since the introduction of data protection, and in my personal opinion, most organisations have gone over the top in the application of it, and hopefully that will calm down. But I just wondered if you had any views on how you would go about automation, what the implications would be, or is it not even worth exploring, given what you've said already? Because even if we were to achieve it, then how are we going to pay for it all? Because it undoubtedly would put the figure up quite dramatically.
Professor Spicker.
Well, we've seen recently rather too much emphasis being placed by government in information technology and the belief that information technology will make the problems disappear as if by magic. People can only answer questions that make sense to them and that they know the answers to. But if you ask somebody questions like, can you walk? Are you disabled? They can't often make sense of those as questions. And one of the standard experiences, I think, of just about everybody who's ever done welfare rights is somebody looking at them in bafflement saying, I don't know what to write, please tell me what I should put down. That's not going to be solved by an IT process. And we can't expect IT to resolve human problems that we don't know the answers to ourselves. There is a separate issue which is about automaticity, which is the question of, is it possible to put things into the benefits which mean that people get paid whether they expect it or not? We put an awful lot of emphasis on the initiative coming from a claimant. In technical terms, we treat benefits as what's called a subjective right, that people have to take the initiative, that they're the ones who've got to start off a claim. Now, that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. And if you know about, for example, hospital procedures, it was a standard part of invalidity benefit for many years that the hospitals would issue a yellow slip and say, just put that into the benefit office. You can remove barriers directly in the process through which the benefit is delivered. And that's quite a different process from the sort of thing that we've been calling automation or have been looking to do.
Anyone want to make a comment on that point?
That's really helpful, and I suppose the way you put it, it's not, you know, you put it very succinctly, it's the initiative is given to the applicant, and it's quite a different concept that you get paid whether or not you meet that application or not. Do you think there's anything else to be said about what other barriers can be removed? I suppose in some cases some benefits may be necessarily complex because you have to test, so that's maybe not a good example. There might be other areas where forms could be a lot simpler. One I'm familiar with is did a bit of work with One Parent Family Scotland, and they tell me that there's a high proportion of single parents don't claim benefits, largely because their lives are so taken up looking after their children because they're doing that as single parents, and therefore they just don't get around to filling in forms. And then if they're so complicated, and there's probably anecdotal evidence that the advice centre, in terms of the cuts they've had, there's kind of less opportunity for people just to phone up an advice centre and get it done for them. So is there anything else you can say about removing barriers?
We've been creating barriers in recent years. The whole idea of individual assessment and of undertaking individual assessments through a point scheme, which every person is required to go through, actually puts a lot of people through unnecessary hoops. We know that there are certain channels of information which could be drawn on. You'll never be able to produce the position where nobody gets this sort of assessment, but it could be far fewer assessments, and indeed it could be assessments with far fewer questions. Let me give you a simple example. The point scheme that was devised initially by the Office of Population Censuses and Surveys. They did a validation which basically said, after you've got the 3 most serious disabilities, and you know about those, then any further information makes no difference to the assessment. What do we actually do when we ask people questions? We ask them all, can you go to the toilet? Completely irrelevant and unnecessary. It's an embarrassing question. It's an awkward question. It doesn't need to be there for the vast majority of people for whom that is not an issue. And even for some people for whom that is an issue, if you'd followed the advice about the people who had initially developed this point scheme, you wouldn't be asking it anyway.
Thank you, Professor Shrixon.
Just to follow on from that, we're being told by advice and support workers that we speak to in rural Scotland in our current study that 2 related points to that. One is the way in which GPs' evidence is ignored in the assessments, and thinking about the way that this used to be done. If a GP says that somebody's not fit to work, then that would be a way of cutting out the assessment as it's done at the moment completely. And moreover, where somebody has a chronic condition, we're being asked, why is it necessary for them to be assessed every on this regular basis at such frequent intervals? Is that necessary at all? So those are a couple of things which we're being told on the ground at the moment are unnecessary and could be simplified in that way.
Okay, just on that point, and a few bits for supplementaries. Obviously, we'll look at the regulations for disability assistance when they come forward, and the government's made great play of the fact that this will be done differently. I'd put something out in social media, former debate well spoken in relation to disability assistance in this Parliament. And I got quite a lot of traction on Facebook where people had been unsuccessful previously with PIP and DLA who were going, oh, once this new system comes in, I might actually qualify. So there's a cohort of people out there, obviously, who may have been unsuccessful under the current system, who are waiting for the new system to kick in because they might think they qualify under this new system. So it's that reactive or proactive approach of governments. Would governments know who those people are who have been unsuccessful in the last 1 year, 2 years, 3 years? Because if you know where they are, you in theory could reach out to them and say, you might not get a penny, but guess what? You're entitled to apply. Would that be a very expensive thing to do, perhaps, Professor Bell, if they're successful? But is that the kind of clever use of data that we should be looking at in terms of not quite automation or passporting, but just joining the dots more effectively within the kind of policy sphere of social security?
I've got some experience, I suppose, that's relevant. We've conducted our own Haggis survey of older people. We've linked that to their with individuals' consent to their health records, so we know a lot about objectively about their health history, and so on. And we are seeking, but have not yet succeeded, to link to their DWP records. Now, that is a really difficult process. Linkage to DWP records, I don't know if there's any research group in the UK at the moment that has managed that linkage, but that's the sort of thing. If you were able to access the administrative data, clearly there are pieces of information that could be absolutely vital to an application or assessment procedure for the new Scottish Social Security Agency going forward. It's not all to do with GDPR. Much of it is to do with the way that these agencies are bound by the legislation that has set them up about how far they can share data and how far they can't share data. We were led to believe a few years ago that we were moving into an era where it would be much easier to do that kind of exercise, but so far it hasn't proved very easy.
Okay, thanks. I wanted to give that as an example because one of the things we're looking at as a committee is concrete examples of how we could move towards making entitlement and benefit take-up more effective, and that just seemed to be something there. Several bids for supplementaries on this. We'll take Jeremy Balfour, then Keith Brown, and I've got you there, Michelle. We'll come to you, yeah.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. I don't know what you call a bunch of professors. Good morning, sirs, maybe. I wonder if I could just... pursue a couple of lines in regard to barriers. The Glasgow Disability Alliance have raised the issue of the names of the new benefit, and particularly the Disability Assistance for Working Age, which will replace the PIP name here in Scotland. And their concern is that if you use working as a terminology, that will put off people with disabilities who are not working. There will maybe be an underlying presumption that you have to be in work to get this benefit. On that issue, but maybe just more broadly, how important are titles and names for barriers for people taking that up? And is that something we should be looking at in regard to getting the name right going forward?
A long time ago, I tried to work out whether or not this had any effect, and did a survey about attitudes to benefits and knowledge of benefits. And what I found at the time, sorry, this is a very early study, and I can't sort of put my hand on my heart and say that it was actually worth the effort that went into it at the time I put in. But what I found at the time was that people who had a positive view of benefits would say they knew about benefits and that they'd heard of benefits, including the ones that I'd just invented, and which didn't exist, whereas people who disapproved of the benefits said, I don't know about any of these, and just went down the column saying, no, 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 no. One of the flaws of the threshold model that I refer to in the submission is the belief that we can separate out people's knowledge of benefits from their attitude to benefits. And it's quite clear that there are people who say, I'm not that sort of person, I don't want to go near this, and regardless of what it actually says on the headings, won't try it, whereas somebody who's already got a benefit, and I've mentioned ESA as being an example, might well say, I've got this benefit, I'll see whether I can get that one as well. And it's not actually necessarily down to rules. I think there are other problems. I'd largely agree with the point that you made. I think that there is a problem in the current administration of benefits, which is that people are being asked about work for benefits for which work is irrelevant. And the whole point about the non-means tested benefits is, of course, that they are available to people regardless of whether or not they work. The work is not part of the test. So I agree that it's misleading. I'm concerned too that what we're doing is that we're creating barriers at the point of change. Currently, as the situation stands with DLA and PIP, if you claim before retirement age, you are able to be entitled to mobility allowance, and you can get an extension after retirement age. And that leads to perverse and inequitable consequences. I cannot see why the Scottish Parliament, why the Scottish Government is wanting to maintain that distinction.
Well, that's a simple answer, but we won't go there today. I suppose, I mean, just again, I suppose just if I can maybe just be piecing a wee bit more, yourself or of your colleagues, is, does names matter? So does the name of a benefit affect how people might take it up? So, I mean, to go back to the Glasgow Disability Alliance example, to use work in a title, would that put people who aren't working, who are disabled, off, or that people don't think that deeply?
Of an alternative for it isn't that it's not that easy. I don't know. It's really something.
I'm just a second, just to follow up on. It was actually a comment you made, Professor Sticker, in your submission to us, was which basically, if nothing changes, there's nothing to promote was, I think, a basic summary of what you said for the new benefits. Is that going to be an issue in regard to take-up? But if, a bit going back to what the convener said, if people think it's just exactly the same as we've got at the moment, there's unlikely to be a massive uptake because people will think, well, I didn't get it under PIP, I won't get it under the new system. So does the system need to be radically different to get a higher take-up?
I certainly don't see any evidence that changing the name of Disability Living Allowance to PIP has made a radical difference in terms of the pattern of take-up and the pattern of claims. We should also beware, I think, of the assumption that all we have to do is to advertise and say to people, hey, there's money here, and that people will flock to receive that money. There's absolutely nothing to back that up. The most successful take-up campaigns in the past have been those where people have an entitlement and where you can build on that entitlement through some sort of outreach, some sort of support. It's very noticeable, for example, that in the take-up of housing benefit, that having a social landlord who is guiding you through the process makes an enormous difference to what actually happens. Scotland has not been blessed in the past with large numbers of disability organisations. I see a very substantial transformation in the country in the course of the last 10-15 years in that regard. And I think that that will make a difference over time. I think that the support mechanisms have improved immeasurably from when I arrived here 30 years ago. There are going to be, I think, certain trends in that direction anyway. Certainly, I think it would help if the benefit that people were claiming made some sort of sense to them. If they actually knew what the benefit was for, and I think that that would help to streamline in some ways a process which is far too difficult of access. The other things which I think would make a difference would be if what we had were smaller standalone benefits. One of the problems we've consistently had in the benefit system in this country has been the assumption that all you have to do is to have one large benefit covering everything and people will get it somehow. And the effect, I'm afraid, of having a large benefit is often that basically people don't get all the component parts of it that they should, but that if there are any problems in the administration of that benefit, then everything stops and the effect for claimants are catastrophic. You can build up something which is more personalised, which is more responsive to people by putting together small, simpler benefits in a predictable way.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments?
For the record, I say that I am in receipt of PIP, just for the official record.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. Keith Brown.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think the correct term in this company is a pile of professors, but that gives a bit of my background away, I suppose. Just from what's being discussed, though, it seems to me that this is an appalling system. It does not work. Just some of the things you said. First of all, the limitations of the data, survey-based, self-selecting, all of which, of course, can apply to the GERS figures, but they're accepted as being in tablets of stone and not open to question. But this is a fundamental limitation on improving the system if the information, the data is not there. And you've quite rightly said how even claimant counts don't provide you with sufficient or integrity of data to predict from there. But given all that and the other limitations, things like we've heard from members of the committee, rurality, ethnicity, gender, sometimes all these issues where there's a lesser take-up, it just strikes me we should be looking at a way to make sure that we improve the system. And also, the Deputy Convener asked about whether an IT or automation could improve things, and I think said that this would be more expensive. But surely, if you have examples like the child tax credits, where it was, I think, a £4 billion overpayment by the UK government, or the fraud that we're told is in the system, then surely there can be savings to be made if it was to be more accurate. And just as Professor Spicker, whose I think evidence has been really compelling this morning, said we should think differently, could I just invite you to think differently about the idea of the potential for an IT solution? So one based, for example, starting from your national insurance number, other figures, other data that can be got from the health service to start the process off so everyone's got a personalised set of data, and I know the issues around data and so on. And that itself could be the means by which all the entitlements are put into a system, and even if it's a case you're not wanting the recipient to be the initiator, the state can be the initiator. It can suggest you may also be eligible for a TV licence free or concessionary travel. The decision is always taken by the recipient. Surely we can do better than the system that we have just now, and it needn't necessarily be more expensive.
I mean, there are a number of things there. I think, you know, your first set of remarks was that our understanding of the current system is not good, and that does not lead to, or will not lead to, good predictability of the system, and it will not help in relation to those groups, to understanding which groups are being particularly disadvantaged by the system. That's one set of problems. There's another set of problems to do with improvement in the system, which might, you know, mean changing names, but then more fundamentally changing the structure of benefits. And I'm certainly think that the Scottish Government should look into that, and also look at how they interact with the social care system. It seems to me, given the types of benefits that Scotland has, on the data side, we could do better. I don't see anything that's immediately that there are any innovations currently planned that would really help us in that regard. I mean, partly our data is split in a sense. I guess this will reinforce your views, but for example, in terms of the health data, our negotiations are here in Scotland around access to them, but then as far as DWP data is concerned, our negotiations are in London, and HMRC. The same would apply. So we then become a small part of a bigger whole. So there may be solutions there, but A, they're hard to come by, and B, you have to be a little bit cautious about having an all singing, all dancing IT solution to your problems.
We'll take you after that, Professor Spicker. Yeah.
Just very briefly, I think that there would be a lot to be said for having the forms pre-populated with existing information. But then what follows from that, which is, I think, really important, is that it should be very transparent to the individual to be able to see that information and check that it's correct. And beyond that, something which I'm told is very difficult to tell at the moment is to understand exactly what are the calculations behind the benefits, and particularly changes to those payments that are received. So the transparency of the system to the recipient is, I think, really important, and the more it's automated, the more important that becomes.
I think we need to avoid the assumption that we're going to find essentially a magic solution for everybody. That we've got to understand that one size doesn't fit everybody, that the ways in which the benefit system, particularly in relation to disability, have to work are going to be much more varied, not necessarily individuated, because that creates huge problems for fluctuating conditions and for people who are uncertain about their own situation, but rather varied in the sense of saying we can take out categories. We won't be able to simplify. We'll end up, if we do that, with a system which is actually quite complicated, but one which is potentially responsive to the needs of people. One of the things that's been found about professional assessment is that essentially the more trained the professional is, the more needs that person is able to identify. That doing things well will cost more because we do things at the moment so badly and miss so many of the people in need. And I think it's unavoidable that it's going to cost money. I don't think that there is any way around that. In many ways, that will be one of the tests of how well the Scottish system is performing. But I don't think that that should be a reason not to do it.
Can I just briefly come back to say that, I mean, first of all, the idea of an IT solution doesn't necessarily mean it's being more simple or simplistic. It can be very complex. On transparency, I think we've heard from some of the evidence, most people have a real problem understanding the basis of the entitlements that they have, and even some of the names like attendance allowance are misleading. So the transparency, there has to be accountability. I'm not sure everyone has to know how every system works, and that's perfectly possible to do that within an IT system. I just wonder, and this is no disrespect at all, but if we might have got a different response from somebody involved in the IT field, it could perhaps come up with something. And I do appreciate both the sensitive personal information and the point made by Professor Spicker about it's got to be adaptable and dynamic over time because people's conditions change, understand that. But there must be some scope to use that kind of system to help with some of the shortcomings.
Just to say, yes, I think you can be absolutely confident you would get a different answer from somebody in the IT field. That's usually because they don't know about benefits.
I'm not sure if we should leave that hanging, Mr. Brown, and move on to the next line of questioning. Any additional comments from our witnesses? No, Michelle Ballantyne.
Yeah, thank you and good morning. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things. I think, particularly, I think it was yourself, Professor Smith, that said it around the assessment process. So the first one, you said that about relying on GPs to make that decision on whether somebody's fit to work. And you said that was the word on the ground. And I wondered where that word on the ground was coming from, because talking to GPs, I've had quite a few of them expressing concern about the possibility of it coming down to them because they're worried about the disruption with the relationship with their patients. So that was my first query. The second one, which I was particularly interested in, is when you said about the first 3 questions. You only need the 3 questions on assessment, job done. I think that was yourself. And then I was sitting there thinking, so did they develop all the other questions? And if so, why? If they arrived at the conclusion you only needed the first 3.
So I mean, the GP thing is not, it wasn't coming from GPs. This is coming from people themselves and from the advice and support workers that work with them. And the point really is that people can't understand why, when a GP says they're unfit to work, that evidence is not taken into account, apparently, in their view, in the assessment which is made or in the appeal until it gets to quite a high level and they've waited for several months being denied that benefit. That's what I'm referring to. Of course, the issue is more complicated, and I can quite understand GPs might be resistant to that.
So I think taking the GP's opinion into account is quite different from the GP making the decision. Yes. So yes, I can see that.
Yeah. Sorry, I should explain myself more clearly. No, it's not that the 3 questions are enough. It's that by the time you have considered the 3 most serious disabling conditions somebody has, by the time you get on to what they rank as number 4, 5, 6 or 7, you're not actually adding anything to your information. So the first question is, what are the disabilities that you have?
The point system, when the organisation were designing the point system, I'm trying to get my head around why they didn't design it in such a way that, you know, like a lot of flowcharts where they say, you know, if the answer to this is yes, go to the end, you're finished. You know, I mean, why did they allow it to continue down?
Well, they were developing the point system. What they did was that, first of all, they identified a whole series of domains with different points in them, and then they put it to professional experts to validate the responses. And it's the professional experts who said, look, there's a certain point beyond which we don't need to add in more than 3 domains, because we've got the top information from those 3 domains, and all the factors after that either don't make a difference or are balancing. And of course, the very fact that they're ranked by the people doing the assessment tells you that essentially that by the time you know that somebody, let's say, there are a number of conditions which singly are enough in themselves, like terminal illness, but quite apart from that, let's say that we have somebody who has an amputation and respiratory problems, then that might be all you need to know So you don't need to go through every one of the domains to ask, and is there anything here? And that's the problem with the current system, that we are asking everybody questions which are completely irrelevant to their circumstances and condition.
So did the original design get changed along the way? Was that the issue?
It did get, I think that they lost that. You see, the original design was intended to construct a census of people with disabilities in the United Kingdom, and the purpose of that was to basically to see what level of services would be required. And the government then, when it came to looking at as in case it was the movement to incapacity benefit, said, oh, there's a point scheme there, we can use that. So a point scheme you developed for one purpose gets lifted and dropped in to another system. The government was convinced at the time it did that with incapacity benefit that it would reduce the numbers of people entitled. There was a public advice from the then Department of Social Security to that effect. It had the opposite effect. Right, okay, yeah, so that's the...
I'm going to have to go research that.
On the point of assessment, so one size doesn't fit all. It's not that you want a medical note for everybody, but rather there will typically be, for people with long-term conditions, somebody with whom they have a continuing relationship who can tell you far more validly than would be the case from having an afternoon's assessment in an office in a strange location. And very often that's going to be a hospital consultant, it will be a day hospital or something of the sort, that there'll be somebody who actually knows. And the more you can whittle that down, the less work you need to give yourself in order to do the assessments.
And this is about not taking a particular diagnosis and saying, well, there you are, that's it. For example, I have somebody who works for me with MS and who holds down her job perfectly well and really doesn't want her disability to define.
Just before we explore this further, I'm conscious it's fascinating, and it is fascinating, and we'll look at this again in December when disability assistance regulations for younger people come before the committee as well. It's not really within the scope of the inquiry that we're doing, but happy for you to respond to this, but I'm just conscious that it's not really within the scope of the inquiry.
Okay. Fair enough.
I think the question that you need to ask in relation to that is what you want a benefit that is responding to the level of need that somebody has at the particular point of application? MS is known for its fluctuations. Or is it there for another reason? Now, the real reason why attendance allowance was initially introduced was not to make sure that people got attendance, and it was not to do with extra costs. It was because of compelling evidence that the effect of long-term disability was to have disadvantage to income throughout that person's life, regardless of their status and regardless of what their income was. They'd always effectively be at a disadvantage. So the idea was to start creating a disability income that would supplement that, yes, that would help to level the playing field. I'm afraid current benefits have lost sight of that as an objective, but that's why it was there. Okay.
Yes. I think with the limited time we've got left, I think I would like to ask a few questions on behalf of the entire committee, so we can get something on the record in relation to the Scottish Government's recently launched take-up strategy for benefits in Scotland. Now, just looking at my briefing here, I can see that the only estimates we have for take-up rates so far is in relation to Best Start grant pregnancy and baby payments, and that the aggregate figure for uptake is 67%, with 53% for first births and 77% for subsequent births. I do remember hearing from Social Security Scotland the initial applications for that exceeded what they estimated it would be in the first place. So the system's still bedding in. We've got a new strategy has been published for benefit uptake, which is a statutory duty placed on Social Security Scotland and the Scottish Government. Do you have any initial views in relation to the Scottish Government's take-up strategy, particularly in relation to any estimations they may seek to have on benefit uptake? You don't have to have, but if you do, we'd be quite keen to hear it.
I would just say that they do need to do more detailed analysis, possibly looking at new sources of data to be able to well, we've spent some time discussing the estimation of take-up, and nothing has particularly improved in relation to that.
Okay, no, that's helpful for putting that on the record. Citizens Advice Scotland suggested that in any benefits take-up strategy, then targets might be quite important. Yeah, we get all the caveats around. You've got to hit your baseline, you've got to have your initial estimation of what take-up is. Hopefully that's robust data. But then if it's sitting at 60% and you're launching your strategy, is your strategy in 3 years' time to get to 70%, to get to 65%, whatever that might be, should there be targets attached to any benefits take-up strategy?
The answer to that is yes, but not necessarily targets relating to take-up. This is the point I was making earlier about the difference between the eligibility rules, which will define how many people potentially could receive it, and the target population you actually wish to reach. And it would be helpful to get a sense of who it is that the Scottish Government actually wishes to reach with each of the benefits.
Obviously, vis-a-vis whether it's a universal entitlement or whether it's a targeted benefit, because the targeted benefit is kind of everyone. You want 100%, so that would have to be caveated, I suppose. Any other thoughts on whether there should be targets attached to any strategies so we can measure outcomes?
I would be a little worried in the sense that targeting whom, you know, do you end up with a system that may be already helping some particular group, helping them even more? You have to understand how the system works before you embark on any kind of targeting, it seems to me.
Okay, yeah, Professor Shook-Smith?
Yes, I mean, it's not directly about targeting it, maybe in the sense that you mean it, but just I think two important points in developing the strategy. One is that it should be piloted in some rural areas, and indeed I think there's a need for rural proofing of any changes to the welfare benefit system, preferably working with those who don't take up benefits to see how it works with those. And secondly, I think you'll hear in the second panel something which we're also finding, which is the need for better access to information, advice and continuing support, and the way in which innovative partnership practices are being used already in rural Scotland, like, for example, fuel poverty schemes, which are then linked to offering people benefit checks and that sort of thing, so that, you know, going in one way perhaps can lead to benefit advice through partnerships.
And a final question, which I appreciate, could open up a whole other line of evidence. So even just a brief reply to this final question, if you were able to supplement it after the meeting, that would be very helpful. But I only partially said what Citizens Advice Scotland's recommendation was, because they also said this should include estimates for universal credit, as it acts as a passport to a number of current and future devolved benefits. And there are already issues in relation to uptake of universal credit because it's still rolling out across the UK. But our committees also looked with the Scottish Fiscal Commission, and I mentioned it earlier on, the idea of policy spillover, where if you have a take-up campaign for what is essentially a reserve benefit, and there can be direct causation in behaviour identified, that increase in financial exposure, increase in cash that would cost for the UK government wouldn't be liable to the UK government. Under the fiscal framework, the Scottish government would have to pick up that tab. Now, more generally, my view would be it's crazy that we have a uptake strategy for each individual benefit, and then just for Scottish devolved benefits, and then a separate uptake strategy for individual UK benefits, and then maybe a UK strategy. The people we're going to meet in the next evidence session just want to help those who are in need and have entitlements and want to access the benefits they're entitled to improve their life. So a lot in that. I suppose what I'm asking you more generally, is there the need for a much more strategic approach, to a kind of one Scotland approach to a benefits uptake strategy? And would you have any concerns, because our committee has already expressed some concerns that we would have, that one Scotland approach to a benefits uptake strategy, irrespective of whether that's devolved or reserved, could actually cost the Scottish Government more money vis-a-vis a UK government tab that they may have to pick up. I know there's a lot in that, but I wouldn't be doing my job properly if I didn't at least put that on the record here this morning. Some initial thoughts, and perhaps you could contact the committee after this morning's session as well. Professor Bell?
I mean, this is clearly an issue that is potentially important. It's difficult to put any scale on the sort of no detriment implications of increasing or actions taken by the Scottish Government that end up costing the UK Government additional resource. But a more strategic approach to this, it seems to me, should be a target for the review of the fiscal framework going forward, because ultimately people shouldn't be disadvantaged by the machinations of the interrelationship or lack of a good interrelationship between the Scottish and UK governments, it seems to me.
Yeah. And I agree with that. I think a person-centred approach is what's important, and working out how that affects the financial budgetary lines between the UK and Scotland is a secondary matter. It's the person-centred approach to people who are very vulnerable in society, which is the important thing.
Two things. The first is I don't think that you need unduly to worry about financial consequences of differential benefit take-up. Differential benefit use in Scotland. There already is such use, and it's been standardly taken as part of the UK system, and only that. For example, that ESA and the related elements on incapacity within universal credit are more claimed in Scotland than they are in the UK. I don't think there's been any indication that there was a plan to effectively to change the rules to break away what was there in Scotland. So I'm not sure that that applies as a problem. Overall, in the past, when welfare rights has been successful in Scotland, and it has cost the UK money, we've heard governments complain about that. It was the view of the government in the 1980s, for example, that if people wished not to claim that that was their right, and indeed ought to be encouraged as showing a proper sense of pride and dignity. But the fact is that we did have take-up campaigns, that they were moderately successful, and that it can be done within the nature of the UK system itself. The other thing that I will mention is something which is coming down the tracks. It has already been put off several times, so I'm not sure it's going to happening immediately, and that is that housing benefit elements for pensioners are going to be transferred into pension credit. And that could have quite serious implications for pension credit and for housing benefits. It was announced actually, I think about 2012. It's been put off and put off. I think nominally it's down now for 2021 or 2022, and the Treasury announced because it's been re-announced. But whether it actually is going to happen, I can't tell you. But just to say, look, be aware that is of itself a large issue about UK benefits, which will have an immediate implication in Scotland.
I missed the beginning of what you said there. Which pensioners?
The pension credit that is going to be combined effectively with housing benefit for pensioners. As I said, the announcement has been made more than once, but it hasn't happened yet, in the same way as most transfers to universal credit haven't happened yet.
I think the committee may look at that at some point down the line. I'm conscious that pension credit reforms for mixed-age couples were floated many years ago, and everyone thought they may just never happen, and then all of a sudden they were there, and there was households in detriment. So thank you for flagging that up with us, and feel free, please do, to stay in contact with the committee in terms of any issues you have, particularly that last one about that One Scotland approach to a benefit strategy for the entire nation and free from detriment. I think that might be, well, it's just me talking, might be a sensible way forward. We'll see what witnesses think. Thank all three of our witnesses for giving evidence this morning. That ends this agenda item. We'll just suspend briefly before we move to the next agenda item. Thank you, gentlemen. Welcome back, everyone. We are still on agenda item 2, and we move to our second panel. And the committee will now hear from organisations that have undertaken successful projects to increase benefit uptake. Can I welcome Catherine Henry, Financial Health Check Service Project Manager, Citizens Advice Scotland, Fiona Moss, Head of Health Improvement and Equalities, Glasgow Health and Social Care Partnership, and Peter Hasty, Policy Manager, Macmillan Cancer Support. Thank you all three of you for coming along here this morning, and we'll move straight to questions. Shona Robinson, MSP.
Good morning. We've obviously heard the first panel, and obviously what we're trying to get into now is what works in really helping people to take up their benefit entitlements. And what has come across really through your submissions is partnership working. So, you know, I guess it's like there's no wrong door where people turn up or where there's interaction with people. How do you seize that opportunity with a generic expertise, but then perhaps harnessing specialist expertise when appropriate? So what I'd like to ask initially is how do we develop and maintain those partnerships to improve benefit take-up? You know, are there things that are pressures on that, or how can we do more of that? And ensure that really, you know, we're taking, I guess what we call a holistic approach, being able to look at that wide range of needs, but access specialist support when required. I don't know who wants to kick off.
If you don't catch
Everybody's
my
looking
eye,
at you.
I'm quite happy to.
I do this thing where people don't catch my eye, I just pick someone. So Fiona Moss,
Okay.
that's very helpful.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I think, as you've said, partnership working is fundamental. I work within Glasgow City and across Greater Glasgow and Clyde NHS, and my experience in both is that the partnership work is easier to create and maintain where multiple partners agree with the issue, and actually it's important. So in Glasgow City, we have such levels of poverty. The NHS is absolutely involved in that. In some of our other partnerships, the relationships are quite different because staff won't come across the issues quite as often. So I think there's a bit around finding some common ground to work on, but also having some time to build the partnerships, because that does take time. And as the partners are stretched in other areas, they do struggle to keep and maintain that time. We have, I chair 28 partnerships in Glasgow City alone. So it is a daily task in terms of bringing together people with a wide range of interests. So finding that common ground does take time and effort, from my experience.
Any other comments?
I think I would add to what Fiona said about it takes time and it takes longer term funding. One of the problems that we have with partnership working is that initiatives pop up and disappear just as they're starting to actually achieve things, just as people are starting to get that common ground and to understand how they work. And also I think we've seen that a lot of our partnerships work best when they're local, when they're locally focused and they grow from the ground up, where there's national support to allow that to happen, but not national dictating that you will form a partnership with that person. I think that's what we've seen.
Okay, Peter Hastings.
Thanks, community. Yeah, everything Macmillan Cancer Support does is about partnerships. Obviously, some of our evidence pointed to Glasgow, improving the cancer journey, and it's signposts to over 100 different organisations. It's not all about what Macmillan's doing. So you start off with Glasgow Health Board sending out a letter to somebody who has cancer. Then Glasgow City Council staff get involved, Macmillan Link workers, and we're then signposting a whole range of different advice and support. And without all of those organisations taking part, it would just break down. And so the key is, for Macmillan, the starting point is getting somebody signposted. It's the absolute start of the whole journey. And that's not easy. Some health professionals find it difficult to raise the issue of somebody's finances. You know, they've just been given a long-term illness diagnosis. But the biggest hit that we find with cancer patients is the cost of cancer after their diagnosis, and that is absolutely huge. But it is hard to raise those issues with people, and what we want is the holistic needs assessment, the personalisation of care, so that that just feels part of the journey of somebody to naturally be signposted to welfare support, as well as the whole other range of supports needs that they will need. But it's still a difficult issue for a lot of people, and your earlier evidence showed that people don't like benefits and don't like talking about them a lot, and we're trying to make that conversation an everyday reality for somebody with a long-term condition like cancer.
And I hear what you're saying about that can be a difficult conversation, but is it sometimes easier because the person is not somebody from the DWP or whatever, you know, it's someone who they have built up a relationship with because of whatever it is that they're, you know, whether in your case it was someone with a diagnosis of cancer, but it may be in other cases a caregiver, or is that conversation, first of all, is it easier because of that? But secondly, is it more likely to lead to a positive outcome of a claim because of that encouragement rather than discouragement?
The best example I've ever seen is when the Scottish Government started with Macmillan about 10 years ago, funding benefits advisors in the 5 cancer centres. And the work of the benefits advisors literally get into the chemotherapy ward as people are linked up to getting their chemotherapy and handing them their forms, taking it to the clinical nurse specialist to sign the form, and that's it, done, there and then. And there's that trust that your Macmillan nurse is signposting to you, to those benefits, to the linked workers, and your Macmillan nurse is signing your benefits form. And I think that trust inside the hospital setting, and the evidence we gave in writing, pointed to supporting patients in the hospital setting is so important before they go back out. It's kind of fall off that cliff edge when they leave the hospital setting, and the support of all the clinicians, the consultants, the nurses and all the allied health professionals. And if we can capture people there, as you suggest, they are more likely to have that trust element that you suggest.
We've seen similar in some of the work that we've done with health visit and midwifery, and that there's a trust there between a new parent and their midwife and their health visitor, and removing the barrier to a health professional making a referral to welfare rights, so whether that's co-location or whether it's having electronic referral mechanisms that can be used, is certainly proved successful. We've got a project in Fife where as part of the Money Talk team, where the advisor has a dedicated space in the midwifery ward, and the health visitors and midwives, through their system that they use already, if there's a question that they ask, are you having any money worries? And it's a really simple question. It doesn't need to go in depth, and if they answer yes, it can trigger a referral to the advisor automatically.
Yes, I would just like to pick up on that with our experience of Healthier, Wealthier Children. And I do think there is trust both personally, because you know the individual, but also trusting roles, because sometimes they don't. Sometimes you've had a different midwife each time you've come. You know, you may see a different health visitor. So it's not always just personal trust, it's trusting roles. But the other thing I think that in my experience of being involved in Healthier, Wealthier Children, it's about the way people perceive their entitlement to benefit. That actually having a baby has a massive impact on your finances. Are there any issues that you would like to talk to somebody about? So you don't have to label yourself as having money worries or being in debt or being poor to be able to have a legitimate conversation. And from that, we have found that the vast majority of women using our Healthier, Wealthier Children are actually on the lowest possible income. So we are reaching the right women, but by having different kinds of conversations.
Okay. Can I just follow up? I'll take a second, just follow up briefly, because the idea of partnership working, Fiona, did you say it was 28?
I chair, yes.
My goodness. So I want to mention one partnership which is kind of falling apart, and I'm actually going to apportion blame in relation to this, although it needs to be fixed to make a wider point. So the Queen Elizabeth Hospital Spinal Injuries Unit, for the last 3 years in Glasgow, consultant neurosurgeons were able to send a letter to the DWP to intimate the nature of the injuries of the people who were unfortunately having to be supported at that unit. That fast-tracked a PIP application down from 30 weeks to 8 weeks. And I think it saved the NHS £86,000 per patient on delayed discharge as well. But it was more important, it was better for the patient. And it was clever working. It was really well supported by the DWP, actually, and the NHS at Queen Elizabeth. Centralisation of PIP processes, I think, to Birmingham, I can't quite remember where it went to, meant that that locally organised partnership fell apart. Now, I know the UK Secretary of State is now looking at this again, and hopefully we'll get a positive outcome. But the wider point I would make is, if regional or national agencies change the rules of engagement and are not actually aware of the local partnerships that exist, can there sometimes be some detrimental and unintended consequences? And is that maybe something, I mean, if it's not an issue, please don't raise it, but 28 partnerships is a lot of plates to keep spinning and making sure the relevant agencies are aware of what's going on locally.
Absolutely, and not all those partnerships are anything to do with financial aspects. They're a part of my other roles as well. I think not all partners are the same. And working with more remote partners is challenging because the systems and processes that are put in place often don't coordinate neatly with local systems unless they're given the flexibilities. So for DWP aspects, there are a number of aspects where although we have staff around the table, they don't have the powers or the abilities to be able to make some of the changes that would make our partnerships work more smoothly. So I absolutely recognise that's not to call them out as a single, but the further away the decision making is made from the local partnership, usually the more problematic it is to be able to have conversations that lead to local changes, because a change in one part is not necessarily needed in another part, and that's what makes it difficult.
Any other, before Mr. Bishop, any other comments on unintended consequences by whether it's Social Security Scotland or DWP or whoever been unaware about local partnerships having any unintended consequences? If there's not, that's fine, but I just wanted to see if there was anything there. Nothing. Okay. So
I suppose I would just raise the issue around the support for universal credit and the fact within Glasgow we had a wide range of organisations involved, and obviously a decision that was made elsewhere kind of made that work not quite so well.
Thank you very much. Michelle Ballantyne. Did you not ask for a...
No.
Oh, sorry. I apologise.
Difficult to, easy to get us mixed up, indeed. I mean, we've asked this question quite a lot in different discussions, but I'm just interested to get your view from a kind of local ground level. Is this whole information about GDP and sharing information, and can you share your information with another? And has the, I mean, I think I agree with the Deputy Convener, I think it's been over-interpreted by some organisations and by some groups. But at the ground level, is it causing you problems that you get information and then you can't pass it on to somebody else? Or are you able to get around it?
One of the things that we've strived the most in Macmillan over the last 10, 15 years since we started doing financial advice is that sort of trusted organisation status. We've worked so hard on learning and development with the DWP that they recognise Macmillan's benefits advisors through that long-term engagement that the convener mentioned. And one of the key things on ICJ has been to try to cut down that need for lots of separate applications. And so if somebody's gone through this process and the ICJ Glasgow link worker says this person is also eligible for instance, the clothing grant, then that is allowed to go through, and they have given that trusted status. And we really need to build trust in those professionals, clinical nurse specialists, for instance, and a whole range of people in this field to avoid that constant application in different ways. We could save a lot of money and a lot of people's times if we were more able to do that.
I think we have a number of experiences where we ask patient consent, and if they consent, then we are able to share that information.
Yeah, I would agree with that. One of the examples that we've found is where you embed advice in a GP practice And with the patient's consent, you can get access to their medical records, and then a welfare rights advisor who can see medical records. Filling out a benefits form has a hugely higher rate of success. Many times lower amount of have to go to appeal or mandatory reconsideration where that happens, but it's all based on consent. And I do agree that the rules around GDPR can be interpreted quite strictly, but also for us, our reputation of trust and of confidentiality is probably by far the more important thing in our kind of interactions with clients than, oh, you need to make sure that GDPR is strictly followed. If we're operating by our own values of confidentiality, that happens anyway.
A point you made about getting the medical records for welfare, is there resistance from GPs in regard to that, or generally where, because that would seem to be a very sensible way forward, that if you're doing an application for PIP or whatever, to be able to know exactly what the GP is diagnosing everything at that level. Does that happen a lot? Because I haven't heard of that before.
If I could just say, we've got welfare rights financial advisors going into 22 general practices in Glasgow City at the moment. It is helpful, although quite often the advisor will then need to go and speak to someone in the practice and say, what does this mean? Because actually some of the medical terminology is not that easy to follow within the notes and is often written for an audience of medics. So there is a bit where there's got to be still some interaction to understand that, but it does help immensely, yes.
Thank you.
Yep. There's evidence from, I think, the Improvement Service have published a report on that as well. So I can share that if that's...
Be obliged. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to take Keith Brown in next. Just a note for members was I don't have any particular bids for various themes that we want to cover. Please do bid for the themes. If not, you can just have to listen to my voice for the whole morning, which is not a desirable thing for anyone. Keith Brown, MSP.
Yes, there's three different things that were mentioned there. One was the needs for holistic needs assessments. One was mentioned was personalisation, and also the discussion that's been had about the difficulty of sharing information appropriately. I just wonder if you could have a bit of an imagination leap for a second. Imagine that the person who is in question has on the system somewhere all the different factors about their background, so medical and social and to work and so on as well. And it's all known, and then an event happens, two of which have been mentioned, somebody's diagnosed with cancer or somebody has a baby. Would it not be possible to get round those three particular problems, making sure there's a holistic needs assessment, making it personalised, and also making sure the information is only held appropriately, for that person to be able to simply go into whatever it is and happen, say, circumstances have changed, I'm now pregnant, that could immediately show an estimate of what the financial implications, benefits and otherwise would be, and also could suggest, say for example, if it was been diagnosed with cancer, these are some local groups that you want to get in touch with, Macmillan for example. Would that not be a way that left the person with autonomy? And I know there's issues with data being held and so on, but would that not be a good way to personalise it for somebody and to give that holistic needs assessment?
Yes, Peter Hasty.
And Macmillan has been trying out in a lot of areas electronic holistic needs assessments, where in a sense, the person is doing it with them, the link worker is doing it with them, but they're given an iPad with this list of opportunities, and if the person doesn't want to go down a certain road, they don't have to. So we're giving people that choice. I'm not sure how soon we could get to that next stage that you're suggesting, but certainly the use of electronic holistic needs assessment has came a long way in opening up all of the possibilities very, very quickly, and that is what the dream personalisation focus for us would be. As Ms Robinson was mentioning earlier, in 2016 the Scottish Government's cancer plan announced the Transforming Cancer Care partnership of £18 million to spread this best practice across Scotland, and the First Minister announced it in August this year. And that will be, we've gone to Dundee and Fife already, Western Bartonshire next, Renfrewshire, and we're going to spread it all across Scotland so that that holistic needs assessment is put in place. And I think that what will happen as the years go past, we'll learn from what we've done in Glasgow, we'll learn what's happening now in Dundee, and we'll move faster and forward towards what you're getting at there. but I think that journey will take time. But certainly electronic holistic needs assessment is something that has gone down very well where it works well. Not all health professionals enjoy using that, for instance, but certainly where it's working well, we know that the patient appreciates that.
I'll just add, I do think there's opportunities, but there are complexities in that. Even if you take something as straightforward as pregnancy, not every pregnancy goes to full term. What would happen under certain circumstances? You know, there's a lot of nuances that would need to be worked through for something as straightforward as an event like pregnancy. So I think yeah, it's something to be explored. But the other aspect I would say is there's a lot of discussion about the IT systems that you use for benefits. You also have to be thoughtful of the IT systems that your receiving organisations have, like the NHS, and we have multiple of them, and some talk better to others than you know. So there's complexities both from your own systems and also from your receiving systems that would need to be worked through.
Catherine Henry?
No, nothing to...
Okay. Keith, can I just, one of the reasons why we were keen to have your three organisations here today was because you've demonstrated quite significant success in helping those in need of support. And I'm not sure if you actually put it on the record, so let me, in fact, no, why don't you each individually talk about, because we've got it in the briefing paper here, but if each of you could just say about the numbers of clients and referrals you've had and the amount of monies that you've been able to actually get for individuals and families, as well as debt written off, I understand as well. That'd be quite helpful to put in the record here today before we have a follow-up question. Mr. Hasty, if you want to, whoever's the first.
Whoever's first to get quickly through the briefing. So, I mean, one recent example was we started ICJ in Dundee, following on from Glasgow, and in March there we put out a press release saying £350,000 worth of benefits had already been realised through those link workers, and that's the kind of scale. If you'll excuse me while I quickly move through, but we're talking about in the.
Apologise, it wasn't an attempt to kind of not have your data in front of you. Just thought rather me talk about your success, it'd be better if you put it on the record. But our Spice has helpfully prepared some of that data. So it's £1.6 million generated in financial gains so far for improving the cancer journey, with £107,000 debt written off, which is a substantial benefit for people in significant need at a really crisis point in their lives. Apologies, Peter, in relation to that.
The scale of need that ICJ in Glasgow has found is quite dramatic, and I think housing and benefit has been the main, and there's a whole range of needs. But I think, sadly, and particularly late cancer diagnosis is often coming in tandem with many, many other difficulties in the person's life. And ICJ in Glasgow is uncovering far more need than perhaps was initially envisaged. But we can see the numbers in the briefing are absolutely huge, and clearly this needs to be spread across Scotland.
Which is, fun enough, you almost guess what the follow-up question is going to be. Fiona Moss, do you want to say a little bit about the benefit to the clients that you've been serving? Yeah,
absolutely. In terms of, well, there's a number of areas that the NHS particularly have been developing. I think the reason I'm here is the Healthier, Wealthier Children, but that's only one of them. And actually, I mean, I gave you last year's figures, but in the first quarter this year, we had 1,322 referrals just in 3 months, with a gain of just shy of 2 million. So we now have a service that is a really substantial service. We do have more health visitors referring than midwives. That's an issue we're constantly trying to address. So at the moment, only 29% of our referrals are coming from midwives. And there is a body, a small army of people across the NHS who are constantly going out and training health visitors and midwives and keeping it on the agenda, having targets set for some of the local teams so that people are actually undertaking the work to make this happen. So it doesn't just happen by itself.
Absolutely. Catherine Henry, do you want to add in relation to citizen advice?
Yep, so the Money Talk team, formerly known as the Financial Health Check Project, since its inception in November 2018, I'm in the process of pulling together the 12-month report, so I don't have that figure. So I've got the figures from 9 months, which was that we had seen 7,777 clients. with, between our face-to-face service and Every Citizens Advice Bureau and our national telephone line as well. Of those clients, we have outcomes recorded for 3,198. I'll expect that number to go up because we follow up with clients after 2 months, and over 6 million of client financial gain for those 3,200 clients.
So the reason for wanting all that on the record is because clearly each of you have demonstrated really substantial success for people that we want this inquiry to make recommendations to improve further. So I suppose two questions. One is the future of each of the initiatives that you're running, is that secure for the long term, given the success that you've demonstrated? But more importantly, are there gaps across Scotland where more of this could be happening in a more systematic way? And how do we drive that kind of change, not just in the area that you're working in, but are there other bits of welfare advice where you're thinking, there's other partner organisations that are maybe missing a trick, they could do something similar? Because at the end of the day, we can talk theoretically about all of this as much as we like. It's about the actuality of what's happening on the ground, and all three of you have demonstrated the pounds and pence of helping people in need. So in terms of the future of your own initiatives, and then how this could be widened out to help a greater cohort of people. Peter Hastie?
Well, as I suggested, we were absolutely over the moon when we launched in August here with the Scottish Government, the 18 million Transforming Cancer Care Partnership, and that will spread across Scotland. What we know from Glasgow and Dundee and Fife is not everybody takes up that offer, because not everybody needs that offer. And so it's not that we suggest that every single cancer patient or every single person with a long-term condition will necessarily want to go through all of this process. But what we do aim to do is have essentially that offer to every cancer patient in the length and breadth of Scotland by the time we've rolled out. And as I said, we're going to West Dunbartonshire and Renfrewshire next in the next few months. And obviously it takes time because you've got to build up the trust of the health professional to signpost. Health professionals are very busy people, and they would be upset if they were signposting to a system that didn't work or that wasn't there or was out of date. And it does take a long time. You know, in Glasgow, Greater Glasgow Health Board, when we first signed up to it, sent a letter to every cancer patient. But actually, more people now get the holistic needs assessment from a referral. And that's the key. This is really a workforce issue. And as you suggest, can you sustain that workforce? And we believe we can with this partnership, but obviously there is always challenges to that with partnerships with local authorities. But really, it's the workforce that's the key to this. And we see spreading that journey, the Improving the Cancer journey across Scotland in the Transforming Cancer Care programme is the way to give the opportunity for everybody to have that holistic needs assessment. And then that starts their journey on personalisation of support.
Before I bring others in, Deputy Convener, was it specifically Improving the Cancer journey, or should we let the other witnesses give their...
No, it was broader than that.
All right, so we'll take Fiona Moss and then Catherine Hendry, and we'll come in, Deputy Convener.
From a Greater Glasgow and Clyde NHS point of view, the majority of our financial advice support across the NHS, whether in hospitals or in primary care, is funded from non-recurring sources or from external partners who have acquired resources for a period of time. So every year, I go through a few months where we are trying to sort it out so there's an existence for the next year. It's and we're very committed, so we are trying where we can, but it is also quite an expensive undertaking. And if I give you an example, we've got 22 GP practices with financial advice now in place, one session a week. We costed what that would cost for Glasgow City to make that available for one session a week for all our deep end practices, our most deprived practices, and one session a fortnight for all other practices. And that costs 800,000 a year. Just for Glasgow City. So it is a challenge. We would like to do an awful lot more, but it is a significant commitment for the NHS in taking this forward.
Absolutely, it's important you put that on the record as well, so thank you. Catherine Henry?
Yeah, so the funding for the Money Talk team is up until the end of October 2020. And as yet, there's a 2-year commitment in legislation to the project. So as yet, we don't know what it looks like beyond that. I would echo some of the earlier points about longer term funding leads to much better outcomes, much better ability to measure outcomes as well. And also some of the things that we fund through both the Money Talk Team project and another Scottish Government funded project, our Welfare Reform Mitigation project, are outreach work, and that does come with an extra cost. There's the cost of actually physically getting someone to a different location. There's the time cost if it involves home visiting, for example. But I would say that that service is valued by the people that it reaches so much more than it's not just a straight numbers exercise. It's not a straight, you've seen 10 people, that's good. You might have only seen one person at that outreach, but the difference that you've been able to make to that one person is of greater value.
That's helpful. Thank you. Pauline?
Yeah, I mean, that is helpful. I suppose it's something we have to register in the course of the inquiry, that there is a cost to promoting uptake. And if those funds fall, then there's definitely going to be problematic. Because the key thing about your organisations is that there are pathways. So, Macmillan Cancer Support, you've got contact with cancer patients, so you can use that pathway to promote it. In health improvement, you have pathways through GP practice, albeit that it's expensive. My question was really for you, Catherine, around trying to get a wee bit more about also who are the people who are have the unmet need. Now, I know that in the evidence we've got older people, but we've had previous evidence from the previous panel that suggested that actually it's maybe in more affluent communities that the uptake is lower for whatever reason I don't quite understand. But it strikes me as just looking at groups like foster parents, single parents, children with parents with chronically ill children, remoteness from a service, it must be major factors in people not. And there are no obvious pathways for those groups unless they're coming in contact with GP practices, health services. And I just wondered if you're able to see, Catherine, I mean, how variable is the service that you're providing? So suppose if you were thinking, if you were a parent with a chronically ill child and you needed support, you say, what benefits am I entitled to? So you might know of the service, this is an advice service, so you might ring up. What would be the sort of pathway for individuals? Is it quite sporadic across the country? I mean, and I'm acutely aware of cuts to advice centres, so I ask it in that context.
Certainly for face-to-face advice, I would say it varies by local authority and by rurality, as we heard in some of the earlier panels, by distance. What we're trying to do with some of the moves towards multi-channel advice, and I know that's not going to be suitable, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, but certainly our telephone advisors can give the same level of advice, the same amount of advice to anyone. Obviously, when it comes to filling in a form, there becomes a bit more of an issue. But certainly for talking people through their solutions, we're using telephony and we're piloting the use of web chat and some other projects as well to try to overcome some of those barriers. And recently, I mean, back to the conversation about data protection, all of our bureau are actually their own independent individual charities. So we've put in place agreements between our bureau to allow clients to move. So our telephone advisor, who is based at one bureau, can access data from a client who is a client of another bureau. And that was quite important to us for this project, because clients don't see that they're phoning a helpline that belongs to one bureau and they're going in to see their advisor in another bureau. They just see the Citizens Advice Bureau service. So it was really important to us that we brought those barriers down.
So that's helpful to know. So does that mean that anyone in Scotland can phone and get advice, or they wouldn't be told, oh, we're not your correct service, you have to go somewhere else?
It's a little bit complicated with the Money Talk team, because obviously we're funded for a specific target group, but we're not in the business of turning people in need away. So our advisors will help those people, regardless of whether they fit in a nice neat box or not. So people can phone for benefits support and for income maximisation advice. They can phone the Money Talk team helpline. For wider advice issues, consumer issues and things, there are other helplines that exist as well.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Okay, Alistair Allen.
Thanks very much. We talked during the evidence from the last panel about whether there were disincentives or perhaps differences between different parts of the country when it came to claiming benefits. Are there also barriers, in your view, about applying for benefits? Are there any particular groups or communities that you feel are disadvantaged on that?
Fiona Moss.
Could I pick up on one? And it's just our experience of a service that we've had with our special needs and pregnancy team in Glasgow, which a local money advice organisation had acquired resources to be able to provide, and it's worked very well. But the feedback from that organisation to us has been that the women that they're working with have levels of vulnerability that they're really shocked by, and they've been working in financial advice for many, many years, and that they are completely out with the welfare system. They are not part of it at all. And we've been having some local discussions around there are groups where we need to be more proactively advocating and supporting, because there seems to be more people locally for us that we're coming across that are just out with every system. So are there groups that are more vulnerable? Well, that's one we've only discovered because actually there was an opportunity to look. There will be many others.
Is that you okay?
Well, I was just going to add on rural. One of the main issues with Macmillan, remote and rural, and obviously, you know, somebody can live in a remote part of a housing estate in a distant part of a city, a city, and still be three buses away from the hospital. And what we've tried to do is capture people, as I said earlier, in the hospital setting, because as they get back to the remote and the rural, it's less easy to access that. And no matter how much workforce we put in, no matter all the fantastic partnerships with the Scottish Government, with health boards and all that, it's still really hard to capture somebody. They've had a cancer diagnosis, they're going through their treatment, they want home. They want out, and there's that very narrow window where we want to capture somebody, and particularly in remote and rural communities, we think that we really, really want to get to them in the cancer centre. Services do exist, of course, with Macmillan Partnerships and lots of other fantastic organisations, but we really strive really hard, because even we have a phone line as well, a brilliant Glasgow-based Macmillan phone line, and again, it just doesn't seem to capture rural as much as we would like it to. And we don't totally understand why, but we desperately try to get people in the 5 cancer centres, because everybody will sort of go through a cancer centre at some point in their journey.
Thank you. You anticipate one of my questions there, and I sympathise with what you're saying there, representing a constituency where people who have that diagnosis are often told to try and get home by plane. So it can be a difficult situation for many people. I was just keen to know whether any of in the panel had other stories of means that you've used to try and overcome these barriers. Put you on the spot. In terms of targeting groups that are less likely to claim, and whether that can be overcome.
Fiona Moss, you're always first to catch my eye.
I've always got something to say. I think you can appreciate that. I mean, we've trialled a number of areas where we've linked financial advice to services. So our HIV service, we've got cancer work going on, we've got other aspects of acute work going on, as well as in primary care. That's the bits of the jigsaw that we can support as an NHS, and there are other ways to connect with other patient groups around some of those as well. We are also trying to explore where there is unmet need potentially, and we do, you talked about data previously, we do a very big health and wellbeing survey in the city, 4,500 people every 3 years, and we also had a survey done for our 5 largest ethnic communities in Glasgow, and what we found there is the Black African community were showing levels of poverty that were equivalent to our poorest places in Glasgow City. So we're now doing a wee bit of work trying to engage with people around where that might be and what might be going on there and whether we need to support. But I guess there's a general, we need to be inquisitive and we need to be asking where is the need that we're not seeing.
Any other comments on that?
Libraries, Macmillan's done a lot of partnership in libraries, and the first big partnership was in Easterhouse Library with Glasgow, and that gave people a more safe space with soft couches, softer branding, rather than going maybe to a DWP office, maybe going to a difficult place, going back to the hospital even might not be something somebody wants to do. And in the library setting, again, it's a much softer, informal place with volunteers. But from that, we go back into the system, try to signpost people to the support line or to a link worker. And we've tried to do that in a different part of the community that feels different from an office, if you like, or going back to an acute setting, which people find, again, difficult.
Henry?
Again, another thing that we found works just being where people are and not expecting people just to come to us. And one of the things we thought quite a lot about for the Money Talk team, which targeting young parents, is where are young parents, where are they going? And one of the bigger successes we had, and it was in Renfrewshire, was with the registrar. Because what's one place you absolutely have to go when you have a child is to register the birth. We've done work with early years settings and with nurseries as well that has also been quite successful.
Thank you. Alistair? Okay. Keith Brown?
Here's listening to some of the comments you've made. Macmillan's interest, and I represent Clackmannanshire and Dunblane, and Alva Academy, I think, for the last 4 or 5 years, has topped the UK League for the money it raises for Macmillan. And it's slightly different challenges from the ones in Glasgow. It's the same rural area. But just hearing some of the comments about the community of women that you talked about before, people were appalled at levels of poverty, and also the Black and African community in Glasgow. It seems to me what you're trying to do is cope with a massive indictment of the system itself. It's all about trying to cope with the effects of the system, and I just have the feeling that actually designing some of these flaws out of the system might be productive as well. But just on the idea of take-up, are there particular examples that you could point to where you've known about an initiative for take-up that's actually had a beneficial impact and it's been verified by being scrutinised afterwards? Is there anything that strike you as quite worthwhile and replicating?
Well, we know the take-up of benefits through things like our Healthier, Wealthier Children. So when we did the full evaluation, 20% of those using the service were able to access DLA for their child. So we know areas like that. At the moment, we're trialling in terms of pensioner credits through our flu vaccination clinics to see if that actually helps us be able to pick up on people that haven't got that. But so we do try and look at it as we go through. But yeah, I think there's quite a lot of evidence of positive benefit take up from the various areas that we have.
Two things we found: the link workers often start to notice that somebody brings a carer with them, their partner, and that carer needs benefits advice. And that's quite a difficult thing to broach because that person's there as a carer. But it often comes out through conversations that that's something that needs support and they need signposting just as much as the person with a long-term condition. And another issue that we find is we've got a support line based in Glasgow. We've got one in York and London, but mostly people in Scotland will get through to the Glasgow one, and they're speaking to a nurse. So they've been in the hospital, but something's gone wrong on a weekend or Tuesday morning, but they can't go back into the hospital setting, so they phone the Macmillan support line, and our support nurses gently try to possibly sometimes sign over to our financial advisors that are in the same floor, but that's not easy, because the person's phoned about going, is this an effect that I'm having? Is this the cancer? Or is it just something else? I've got headaches. Might not be linked to my cancer, and we want to talk through the person, support them, but we try to gently then, and we call it a warm introduction, if you like. We try to, because they've trusted that nurse and they're going back and forward with that nurse on the support line, we try to gently take them over to the benefits advisors as well. But it's not easy because a lot of people get cancer. It's the first time they've ever dealt with the benefits system. They've never dealt with the benefits system before, and I think we forget sometimes that a lot of people just have no idea, no concept of how to deal with benefits at all, and it comes as a surprise to them if we approach them. So it's quite a hard approach, but we try to do it in those two ways.
Okay, Catherine Henry.
One of the things that we found quite good when we did our own marketing for the Money Talk team, so it was our For Your Benefit campaign, is just ease of access to engage with advice and support service. So as part of our radio advertising, we had a text service where you sent a text with the word check to a certain number, and that then triggered an email to our team of advisors who then did an outgoing call to that person. So it takes the onus of, right, I have to phone this person to see if I'm entitled to it, off. You send a simple quick text message and then we phone and arrange an appointment. So it's about ease of access to advice and support services. You can have the best advertising in the world if there's not that then followed by easy access to the support that you need. I think that was the main important point that we wanted to make.
Okay, thank you. Anything else, Mr. Brown? No. Okay. Jeremy Balfour, this maybe our last line of questioning, depending on whether or not you ask theme 5 in relation to the new Scottish Government benefits uptake strategy, which I would like to get some thoughts on the record for at some point. But
I wanted to go on a different theme, but I will happily do that very quickly. I mean, obviously we have got the new, the convener's laid it out for you. Do you have any comments, I suppose, on the government strategy? If you don't have to answer. I can answer whatever question then. And this
well, just hang on there, because I think that's maybe not the way that we'd perhaps wish to do that. It clearly because we have to get some of this on the record, Mr. Balfour, before we close the evidence session. There's a new range of devolved benefits coming over. Some of them will be former UK benefits that come to Scotland. Some will be new benefits that are created. The Scottish Government and Social Security Scotland have got a statutory duty for a benefits uptake strategy in relation to those. The initial strategy's really just been launched. It's just emerging. In general, is the advice sector having to take account of the changing landscape of the benefit system between what's devolved, what's reserved? Have you even had a chance to, it's only a few weeks old now, even had the chance to look at that initial strategy yet? Mr. Hastie.
We've been meeting a lot with the new Scottish Social Security Agency in terms of what we've always done in the past about learning and development. And one of the key things that we would like to see, and we're working really closely with the new agency, is almost them referring to us out the way for a reserved benefit. So we'll be able to treat the cancer patients, whatever benefit devolved or reserved they're dealing with. And referral, we're always referring to things, but Macmillan would also appreciate being referred to by the new agency so that we can then go and support the person with that. And as much that can be done as possible, that everybody links up, because we touched at the start of this about relationships, and it is so much about that trusted organisation status, that if we can build that with the new Social Security Agency, we can get past so much paperwork and so much time consuming and so many appeals, that if the trusted organisation status comes. But we would really like it to be a circular with the DWP, the SSA and with Macmillan, that they are signposting to us to support in the devolved or reserved, whichever way it is.
And that's helpful. And Fiona Moss, I'm conscious you mentioned using the flu vaccine in relation to pension credit entitlements, and there's a reserved entitlement, and there's also a whole range of devolved entitlements as well. So it seems as if you're maybe just getting on with it irrespective of whether the benefit is devolved or reserved. So maybe how you think this new strategy will or won't work for what you're doing?
I mean, I think we're working well with Social Security Scotland. I think our challenges are in that complexity between what is devolved and isn't devolved. And some of the things that we would love to do, there's aspects between what is devolved and not devolved to be able to take forward. But beyond that, I'm not an expert in the different benefits.
And the funding, just I'll come to Catherine Henry, but the funding tends to follow the benefits. So if there's a strategy for a UK benefit, the DWP will decide, like Help to Claim, for example, Catherine Henry, the UK government will decide how much money is to be assigned to that, and then it will identify the partner organisation to roll out with that, rather than, for example, Citizens Advice, who have got a wide range of advice services that they offer, but the funding for it can be quite strand-driven and fragmented, and we're just trying to work out whether there's a better way to coordinate these things. Any comments on that, Catherine Henry?
I absolutely agree that it would be better to be far more coordinated. I mean, one of the challenges that our Bureau have are where a funding stream pushes you down a certain path. people don't fit down easy paths. So a person might come in through, for example, help to claim, but then it turns out that actually they have entitlement to Scottish benefits, they have income maximisation issues, they've got problems with their gas and electricity. So I think what's important for us, and certainly what's coming back from our Bureau when working with Social Security Scotland is, as Peter said, is that referring that circular pathway of making sure that people can get that holistic support wherever they access advice. And I think the main concern that's maybe coming back from our Bureau is about the duplication of services. So if someone accesses support through Social Security Scotland, avoiding our advisor then as part of a benefit check going through the same things that the client's already been through with Social Security Scotland and avoiding that duplication.
That's helpful. Not asking another question, but if you could get back with any information you might have to let Mr Balfour have time to ask his question in relation to a scene in the new strategy. There's to be a series of benefit take-up weeks. Have a think about what those maybe should be. You're at the coalface knowing what those might look like. And in terms of how these things are funded, when I was meeting with Citizens Advice the other day, they were talking about help to claim, they mentioned, I said, what happens after they get their first payment? That's your funding finished, and Citizens Advice said to me, well, yeah, but you've built the relationship up by that point, so they come back to you the next week and the next week and the next week and the next week. So you've been funded for part of that relationship with the claimant, and then that funding ends, but they still have that relationship with you, so there's on cost to that. Any thought? I thought there's not time to reply to that just now, but any thoughts about that would be really quite helpful. Jeremy Balfour, my apologies, but I had to get some of that on the record. Final question.
Just very, I mean, it's really just to Peter. Obviously, we looking at uptake, and one of the issues that we've done is in regard to terminal illness and the change around that. I just suppose, just at this stage, obviously we haven't seen exactly what the new guidance is going to be or how it works, but are you reasonably content with where the direction of travel is going? I suppose just to put on the record for that.
Yeah, so Macmillan and Marie Curie and lots of other charities sat on the Scottish Government's Terminal Illness Stakeholder Reference Group. That ended a couple of months ago after about 9 months. It was a difficult group because it is a big change that's coming, and we want to get it right. So what the Scottish Government are now doing, they've now set up a new implementation group with different group of stakeholders, and we're looking forward to when that emerges, and that will involve the Chief Medical Officer's guidance for GPs. But in truth, I think we need it to get started, and once it gets started, we'll know how GPs and health professionals are starting to take the new, wider criteria on board. But we're certainly very positive of the change that was led, and we're now really waiting the final guidance and the start of it.
Are you confident that, particularly GPs and nurses, have that? Is that training going to be provided? Is that one of the things that you think, for example, Macmillan could offer?
Macmillan will be absolutely the heart of that. Once that guidance is published and once the new criteria is set and once GPs want to get going, because GPs have been asking us a lot, when does it start? And you can't rush these things, it is a big change. But I think there's a real opportunity there for that learning to be taken forward so that we make sure we support whoever it is at the end of life once they've got that terminal diagnosis, and we don't have the GPs don't have to worry about an exact moment of time. That support can be built in. But I think we'll just have to wait to see till it launches when we get that guidance going.
I'm grateful.
Really helpful line of questioning, perhaps not for this inquiry, but the future what we're going to do from December onwards, when the draft guidance for disability assistance for younger people will come to Parliament, and the Scottish Commission of Social Security will look at that and give thought to how that's all going to work as well. But your thoughts, Mr Hastie, are very welcome. Apologies that it's so rushed this morning. Please do stay in contact with us, in particular any concrete, we will deal with the abstract politicians always do, but any concrete examples of how we can passport benefits better, how we can automate benefits better, how we can take stigma away from the process, how we can give more secure funding, because when we get towards recommendations here, we'd like to be focused and improving rather than just having another report that talks about the kind of things that we would like to do. And I know you've not really had much time to talk about that today, so please keep that relationship going, follow the evidence sessions, and do get back in touch with us. So again, thank you. It's so rushed. That does conclude agenda item 2. We now moved very briefly, committee members, to agenda item 3, which we've agreed to take in private. So thank you.